Amen. Anybody here ever get tempted? You ever tempted to do something wrong? Tempted to steal, or tempted to lie, or tempted to complain, or tempted to hold a grudge? I think we're all tempted to do things that are wrong, and in James chapter 1, it talks a lot about temptation. We've been going through James slowly, and we've been talking about spiritual maturity. And if you follow the first 12 verses of James chapter 1, you'll see a lot about how to gain spiritual maturity in your life. And if you've been following along the past few weeks, you have probably seen that a spiritually mature Christian responds well to trials. Do you remember how a spiritually mature Christian responds to trials and troubles in verse number 2? What does it say? They count it all joy. Now, there, am I spiritually mature or spiritually immature? When trouble comes into my life, am I able to see that God can use this as an opportunity for me to grow? Or do I only complain and gripe and get angry about the trouble in my life? You also see in verse number 5 that the spiritually mature Christian is praying. He's a man or a woman of prayer, because if they lack wisdom or any other lacks that they have, maybe they don't have enough food, or they don't have a place to stay, or they're behind in their rent, they ask of God. So here we're getting an idea of how to measure spirituality. It's not just going to church on Sunday. It's handling trials well. It's praying when you're in need. And then last time we were in verses 9 to 11, where you can see that they really start to understand about the brevity of life. A spiritually mature person understands that life passes very quickly. It's like a blade of grass or a flower that pops up and then fades away. And they understand that everything in this life is ultimately going to fade away. And then tonight we're going to come to verse number 13 and following. And that shows us how a person responds to temptations. So we have their response to trials, their prayer life, their understanding of the brevity of life and how quickly life passes, and then their approach to temptation. All of this are measures to help me understand if I'm doing well spiritually or if I'm not doing well spiritually. So let's read here. We're in James 1:13. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. Have you heard that before? When you're tempted, don't say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. So then where does my temptation come from? If it's not from God, it comes from within. There's three places, right? Either the world. What are our enemies? The world, the flesh, or the devil. So it might be the devil made me do it. It might be the peer pressure from the world, or I'm bad enough to come up with enough bad things all on my own. I don't need anybody to help me fall into sin. So my temptation, it says in verse 14, every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. Do not err, my beloved brethren. So there's a lot of error and misconception about temptation. We want to try to get a few things right tonight. And since we're talking about spiritual maturity, let's say it this way. The first 12 verses tell us how to gain spiritual maturity. Now these verses tell us how to lose it. Right? You gain it by responding well to trials, praying, understanding how quickly life passes and investing in things that have eternal value. And you lose it by falling into temptation, yielding to temptation, falling into sin. You see that because sin, it brings forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. So I can either gain spiritually or lose spiritually, and I certainly lose a lot when I fall into temptation. In those verses that I read, the word tempted appears 5 times. Did you notice that? Verse 13, let's count them out. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. 5 times is the word tempted. So that's the theme for tonight, and specifically what we're going to lose or what's going to get damaged when we fall in our temptations. I suspect all of you, like me, have a lot in your life. God's blessed me in many ways. In fact, in the next few verses, he's going to say about all the gifts that come down from above. And we have our family, our reputation, ministry, health, job, possessions. All of it could be lost if I fall into temptation tonight. Right? People won't look at me the same way. They won't listen to me ever again. They won't trust me. My wife may leave. My daughter may turn against me. I might lose everything that I have, all because I fell into some temptation. So it's really dangerous. Every good thing that you have in your life, except one. What's the only thing you can't lose? Oh, yeah, that's good. You can't lose your salvation, right? Now, some people believe you can. I don't believe that you can lose your salvation. I think that once you're saved, you're always saved. We certainly fall into sin, and we're out of fellowship with God. We lose our ministry and our reputation and our testimony and everything else. But I don't believe we lose our salvation. So you'll keep your salvation, but you could very well lose everything else. So we have to be careful with temptation. I'll mention a couple of thoughts here. Probably we'll just get to the timing of temptation and the term temptation. Let's talk first about the timing of temptation from verse 13. Somebody said, I don't know who said it, but somebody said, opportunity knocks. You've heard that phrase? Opportunity knocks, and they added, opportunity knocks once. Temptation leans on the doorbell. It never seems to go away. Do you find that? You may be tempted today for things that you had been tempted many years ago. And you thought, well, I thought I already dealt with these things and overcame in that area. And yet you're still being tempted today with things that you were tempted with long ago. It just keeps leaning on that doorbell over and over again. So look in verse 13, the timing of temptation. It says, let no man say when he is tempted. So it's not if you're going to be tempted, or you may be tempted. It says when you're tempted. Remember back in the second verse, he said the same thing about trials. When you fall into those diverse temptations and trials and difficulties of life, it's not if they're going to come, it's when they're going to come. And we all face temptation. It's not like you become so spiritually mature one day that no longer will you be tempted. Not in this life. Every believer will be tempted. When we fall into temptations, it says. Now, he doesn't tell us exactly when, but I think the layout, of the first 12 verses help us see when we fall into temptation. Pardon me. Remember all the trials in verse 2 and all the lack in verse number 5, all the need for wisdom. In verse number 9, the brother being brought low, and then he talks about temptation. So I would suggest that when we're at a low point spiritually, troubles, lacking, in desperate need of prayer, being brought low, that's when we might be tempted. And I think I might lose my voice here shortly. I'm not feeling very well. So I'll try to get through a few of these points. But we may be tempted when we're very low, physically, emotionally, or spiritually, or otherwise. So if you're at a low point in your life, you have to be very careful. Paul said, take every thought into captivity. And the idea is like, when you're at a low point spiritually or otherwise, you have to be so careful with every person who comes into your life, every opportunity, everything that you see and hear. It may be a temptation. And remember, they're disguised. So if you're not feeling well, if you're not well rested, if you're having trouble at home or at work, you're mentally unstable, you're spiritually far from God, be very careful. I think that's oftentimes when the devil attacks. I think you see that in Joseph's life in the Old Testament. Dear old Joseph was far from his father's house. He had been mistreated by his brothers, and he had been sold to the Midianites. He was a slave in Potiphar's house, and at that low point, Potiphar's wife came in. Thanks, Randy. I think I need a lot more than that. But I don't know if that's going to help. No. I think I need some bed rest. That'll help me get through, though. So Joseph was at a low point in his life when Potiphar's wife came. And Jesus, not spiritually, but physically, was at a low point in the wilderness of temptation. He had fasted for 40 days. He was hungry. He was weary. He was alone. And the devil came to him. So I would suggest that if you have a really rough week or day or time, be careful. Your temptations may come more strongly when you're weary or low. So that's a little bit about the timing. That's not the only time we're tempted, of course. Everybody knows you can be at a very high point spiritually and be severely tempted. Christ in the wilderness, he was at a low point physically, but he was at a very high point spiritually. The angels were ministering to him. He was in fellowship with God. He had just been assured of his sonship. He had just been baptized by John the Baptist. He was about to begin his public ministry. A very high point spiritually, and the devil came to him. So I guess that means I can be tempted in church, right? I can be tempted while I'm preaching. I can be tempted while I'm witnessing. I can be tempted while I'm reading the Bible. I can be tempted while I'm praying. It's not just when I'm far from God that I'm tempted. I can be very close to God and be tempted. So don't think that there's something necessarily wrong with your spiritual nature when you're tempted, which I think is the temptation, not to use the word too many times, but I think the idea sometimes is that since I have these strong desires and I really want to do these bad things, I must be really far from God, because if I was close to God, I would never have feelings like that. And yet you can be very high spiritually and have very ugly temptations at the same time. Do you agree with that? Or is it only ungodly people that have ungodly temptations? I think very high spiritual people have very innate natural desires that come upon them sometimes when they're in prayer, when they're doing God's work. I don't believe it's a sin to be tempted. It's a sin to yield to the temptation. So just because you have these dark clouds gathering around you and these desires and forces, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily far from God. You will be once you yield to that temptation, if you do, but not just because you have those pressures upon you. So that's the timing of temptation. Low points, high points, we have to be very, very careful. Let me also mention just briefly the term temptation. It has three parts to it. You can see them there in the verses that we read. It says in verse 13, let no man say when he is tempted, I'm tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempted he any man. Every man is tempted when he's drawn away from his own lust and enticed. So there seems to be three parts here. There's the drawing away from the good, right? I have good in my life. I have responsibilities in my life. I have principles and convictions in my life which are proper and right. The Word of God, the prayer, church fellowship. I have lots of good. Somebody wants to draw me away from all of that. I have a stable marriage. I have a nice daughter. I have a good reputation. Somebody wants to draw me away from all of that so that I don't have those good things anymore. So that's one part of the temptation, the drawing away from the good, the responsible, the upright, the proper, the blessing. And then there's the leading into what's wrong. So somebody, the devil, not only wants to take me away, draw me away from the good, he wants to lead me into the bad. He wants me to have rottenness and sin and filth and ugliness and bitterness and anger and wrath and everything else. That's what he wants to lead me into. So there's two parts there. I'm being drawn away from the right. I'm being led into the wrong. And then he always has a lure or a bait or some little worm that he dangles in front of me to get me from the good to the bad. So there's really three parts. Wants to draw me from the good, wants to lead me into the bad, but has a little trick, a little lure there, bait, a hook that brings me from God to evil. And we can talk about that another time. I think my voice is pretty well gone, but I do want to tell you a couple of last things. Let me mention, I'm getting a little mixed up in my pages here. I should have numbered them. Let me mention a young Baptist fella. He was 34 years old, Horatio Palmer. This was back in the 1800s. He was a choir director, actually. And he wrote this hymn for his church. It's in our hymn book. Yield not to temptation, it's called. Yield not to temptation, for yielding is sin. Each victory will help you some other to win. Fight manfully onward, dark passions subdue. Look ever to Jesus, he'll carry you through. Ask the Savior to help you, comfort, strengthen, and keep you. He is willing to aid you. He will carry you through. That's written by a 34-year-old man who was a choir director who faced temptation. And if you keep James 1 in context, he's already told us, if any man lacks wisdom, ask of God. So pray. If you're being tempted, you know you're being lured away from what's good into what is evil, and pray that the Lord will help you to see that hook, help you avoid the temptation, and help you to remain strong for the Lord. Because a lot of damage will be done, right? And that's my last little illustration. So I'm going to destroy something here. So if you don't like loud noises, just cover your ears. I got a big piece of drywall here. So I found this downstairs. The guys were renovating out in the entry area. So they had all this drywall, right? And so I went down and I got a hammer because I want to destroy this piece of drywall. So let's say that I'm tempted, okay? And I'm tempted to put a big hole in this drywall. Now I want to show you what happens when I yield to my temptation, okay? So there's a little lesson here. So I'm going to make a big noise, so you might cover your ear, because I'm going to put a big hole in this with the hammer, okay? You ready? I'll do it on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Now, I was tempted to put a hole in that drywall, and I yielded to my temptation. Now, I want you to notice a couple of things. It made some damage on the surface, but the most damage is behind the scenes. Okay, you watch when I turn this around. Look at how much more damage was done where you couldn't see compared to what you could see. And in fact, behind me here, I got a huge mess. You can't see it, but there's a mess all the way to the door there. It's, well, I'll give you the $8 that it costs. So that's the way it is when you yield to temptation. The greatest damage is the damage that you can't see. The second thing that this teaches, it only takes a second, just a split second, to yield to that temptation and put that hole in that drywall. Now, that can be fixed, can it? You've probably seen it. You've probably had a hole in your wall or seen a hole in a wall. That can be fixed, and that's the good news. But it's going to take a lot longer to fix it than it took to make the hole. Okay, so if you yield to temptation, it's only going to take you a short while to fall into that sin. It's going to take you a long time to, it can be repaired. I need to take the hammer out. I need to make sure to fix up the edges. Then I need to get some fill and some tape. I have to do several layers. I have to sand it between each layer. Then I have to prime it and wait. And then I have to paint it probably with some primer and then paint it a couple of coats. It's going to take days to fix this hole. It can be fixed, but it takes a lot longer than it did to fall into the temptation. And the third lesson about this little illustration is that the part that's fixed may never be as good as it was the first time. So it can be fixed, and you can go on, and maybe nobody will ever notice, but it may never be fixed as well as it was the first time. So just keep that. By the grace and miracle of God, it may be stronger. Who knows? But naturally speaking, it's not going to be as good as if you had it left alone to begin with. Does that make sense? You remember that illustration? Okay, good. Now we need somebody to clean up the mess. All right, thanks. All right, I'm glad my voice held out for that because I wanted you to see that. That's a good one. All right, a few prayer